Next up, it's our Friday feature movie spotlight, reviewing the latest releases at the Korean box office and online. And of course, we do that with the help of our esteemed critics who are with us now. First, to my right is Jason Bechervaise. Jason, hello, it's good to see you.
Hello, Joe, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. And to my left, we have Marc Raymond as well. Marc, it's great to see you too.
Yes, it's good to be here.
Okay, so as we flagged up last week, the only major release this week is another Marvel superhero blockbuster. It is AntMan and the Wasp: Quantumania. It is the third in the AntMan series and the 31st film of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, or MCU. And as the title suggests, this ever-expanded universe explores something called the quantum realm. So, Jason, can you tell us more?
Yeah, most of it's set in the quantum realm, which frankly I think was a mistake. So we'll get onto that shortly. And so, yeah, I don't want to summarize, all the films up until this point, the MCU, like you mentioned. But of course, we had, the two Ant-Man films that came previously. And also, you've got Avengers, Infinity War, and Endgame, and you've got the various subplots, that kind of come together. And it gets a little bit convoluted. But for those of our listeners who are familiar with the Ant-Man films, you remember that you've got this character called Janet, played by Michelle Pfeiffer, and she was stuck in the quantum realm for somewhat 30 years, which is depicted in Ant-Man and the Wasp. So now, after Scott Lang's aka Ant-Man, his daughter Cassie, along with Dr. Pym, played by Michael Douglas, they basically start experimenting at home with technology that allows them to make contact with the quantum realm. And literally, they're all kind of pulled in Jumanji style, along with Hope. So that's where most of the film is set. Their home is set in San Francisco, and that's where, the other Ant-Man films are set. And so then we realize that Janet has she hasn't been exactly frank in telling them what really happened in the quantum realm, this kind of minuscule dimension that can only be entered through subatomic particles or something like that. So there we have the film's central villain, Kang the Conqueror, played by Jonathan Majors. The villain's name speaks for himself, I think. So the film is directed by Peyton Reed, behind the other two Ant-Man films. And it's the first film of Phase Yawn 5 of MCU.
Right, I can tell already from Jason's quick overview there that he's perhaps not that impressed with it. And,
no!
And reviews have been quite bad as well. It only has a 50% score on Rotten Tomatoes, which is unusually low for a Marvel film. Marc, what did you make of it? Especially because you haven't really seen a lot of the Marvel movies, right?
Yeah, and I think with the most recent films that we've reviewed on here, the Black Panther, Wakanda Forever, and also Doctor Strange, the latest Doctor Strange, I was a little more positive than Jason, maybe because I was less sick of the films, or maybe they had become less repetitive to me because I haven't watched as many. But maybe this is my saturation point, because I think this movie's quite bad. It's the worst of the Marvel films that I've seen. I haven't seen them all, but I've seen 8 to 9 of them, and it's kind of depressing too, because as Jason was saying, there's all these really good actors in this film, and they're just kind of wasted. They have really nothing to do. They're just kind of citing. The script is quite bad as well. I think that's a big weakness of this film. Because the Ant-Man series is kind of like the comedy kind of films within the genre. Like, the MCU is trying to kind of branch off into different genres within the MCU, right? So this has been its comedy franchise. And 95% of the jokes just do not land. They're just it's just poorly written. There's no, and so it's just not very fun. And then like Jason said, so much of the film is in this quantum realm that is just not very interesting to look at. There's just not much to it. So you're just kind of watching these people go through these motions. And the film itself, even especially towards the end, I thought it was almost acknowledging how repetitive and boring it had become. Like, it almost like there's like trying to be like an in-joke, like, oh, you know, it never ends, or it never, and there's these kind of like lines of dialogue, and I'm like, yeah, it sure doesn't never end. And so yeah, it's not a very good film, and we'll see what this means. You know, there's been a lot of poorly reviewed Marvel films of the past year or two, so we'll see if this seems to be continuing in that negative direction with this latest film. Yeah.
Okay, wow. So depressing, poorly written, going through the motions. Jason, anything else to add?
Yeah, it's just really bad. It sucks. You know, I mean, Marc mentioned how, yeah, you know, it's set in, you know, a lot of it's set in the quantum realm, as I also mentioned earlier. And I think it just visually, it's just really not very interesting. It's just, it's all kind of, you know, CGI. You know, my eyes were starting to hurt, and you know, the best part of the film is actually when it's set, you know, in San Francisco, you know, the beginning of the film, and that's where it's funny, and yeah, no, it just gets really, really repetitive. I think the Marvel films, they kind of peaked a few years ago at the end, you know, kind of late 2010s. You've got Black Panther, which was a, you know, seminal film, culturally very significant, and you know, you have Endgame and Infinity War, or the other way around. But yeah, it's in those films, I think, kind of almost repackaged the blockbuster in a really smart way. But everything peaks, and you know, Hollywood, when it sees a franchise that's very successful, you know, Infinity War and Endgame, you know, collectively they generated close to $5 billion. So what do? They just throw out, you know, so much at the audience. We have, you know, lots of series as well, Hawkeye, Loki, you know, all the rest of it. So you know, just Loki rather. But yeah, it's too much of the same thing, and I think audiences are getting really, really bored and fatigued, and I think it's really showing in the box office sales of these last few films. And I think, you know, Marvel for so long were just making, you know, entertaining movies, and I think they just need to figure out what to do now. Perhaps they've overkilled it, you know.
Yes, Marvel seems to be losing its way. It seems to be fatigue kicking in. On that note, Marc, are we seeing that in how it's performing in Korea as well?
Yeah, it's definitely underperforming expectations. It's still the top movie because, of course, as we mentioned, no other films are going to really compete with these movies. And so, but its numbers, like this film, there's been a pattern of this film is making a lot fewer emissions, almost half of what the last AntMan did. We saw this with the latest Thor movie as well. We saw this even with Black Panther, Wakanda Forever, which got better reviews than these films. This film did, but also was much further down than the original Black Panther. The only exception was the Spider-Man No Way Home film, which of course was a huge hit. And that might have something to do with it being Spider-Man, which is like a more durable kind of character.
I think Spider-Man kind of pulls in both demographics. You know,
Right.
that has a big female fan base in Korea.
Yeah.
And also, came out just as the pandemic was ending as well, so
And
people
they're
were...
better films, actually. They're pretty good.
There was pent-up demand for it as well. Okay, so that was Ant-Man, the Wasp, Quantumania, and it's out now in Korean cinemas. Now, because the Marvel release has scared away the theatrical competition this week, as we mentioned, we thought we'd look
What's
at...
next week?
We thought we'd look at some of the Best Picture Oscar nominees that we have not covered yet on the show, and that is All Quiet on the Western Front, which is currently playing on Netflix. The title in Korean is 서부 전선 이상 없다. So, Marc, can you tell us about this one?
Yeah, this is the third cinematic adaptation of Erich Maria Remarque's 1928 novel, a famous sort of pacifist novel about the trench warfare of World War I. And he wrote it about 10 years after that war ends in 1918. He writes the novel in 1928, and it quickly gets adapted into There's a Hollywood version of the film in 1930, directed by Louis Milestone, which wins the Oscar for Best Picture that year. It's a very acclaimed film, still quite an effective one, even today. And there was also a TV kind of adaptation made for American television in 1979 But this is the first German language version of the film. It's directed by Edvard Berger. The basic story, which is probably at least somewhat familiar or has been told, I mean, this novel's been so influential and it's set a kind of template for a lot of war films. There's a young recruit named Paul who goes to the front with dreams of this kind of patriotic kind of glory and quickly becomes disillusioned by the horrific kind of experiences that he sees there. The plot of this version is pretty similar to the book and to the other adaptation, but there are a few changes. Most notably, we get these scenes where we see the negotiations of the armistice of November 1918. So the end of the film takes place as the war is about to end as well. And it's clearly kind of looking ahead to what would come after, because again, the original novel did not have World War II, had not taken place yet.
Right.
So this film knows that, and of course is kind of hinting at, the negative ending of this war is going to have repercussions for the rise of German nationalism, the rise of the Nazis, and then the eventual Second World War. It's also noteworthy this novel was apparently one of Hitler's most hated books. It was immediately banned when Nazis came to power, which I'm sure made the author, who was a pacifist and anti-nationalist, quite proud and sort of happy that he was. It's a good person. It's a good point of pride to be hated by Hitler, I think. Yeah, so.
Okay, so Jason, this is an adaptation of a novel from the 1920s that has already been made into an Oscar-winning film. What do you think is perhaps the point of this adaptation, and does it bring anything new to this material or the war film genre more generally?
Yeah, so often when we watch, war films, First World War films, Second World War, it's often told from the perspective of, the Americans or the British. Not so often do you see films from the perspective of, from the Germans, for example. And some really good war films. Das Boot's a great Second World War film. And there are others too. And so I think, and as Marc kind of mentioned there as well, it kind of, you get to see the negotiations go on and how complex and difficult they are. And I mean, in a sense, I don't think it necessarily delivers anything we haven't seen before. The cinematography is absolutely fantastic. It's brutal. It's a grueling war film. It's quite long. I think you go back to kind of some of the films by Steven Spielberg, of course, Saving Private Ryan, The Thin Red Line. I think those films kind of ushered in a different kind of war film that really kind of conveyed the brutality of war. And I think in that sense, this film kind of very much depicts war as a very horrific thing. It's not patriotic in a sense, but he looks at this central character who becomes quickly disillusioned, wanted to fight for his country and then realizes what war really is. And I think given the conflict in the Ukraine, I think clearly it's resonating with voters right now. I could see it building steam. But to land
for the Oscars,
before the Oscars,
right.
and also the BAFTAs, but to land so many nominations, it was actually quite surprising. It's a good film.
Right, it received 9 Oscar nominations. Marc, what were your thoughts on the film, and do you think it deserves that many Oscar nominations?
Yeah, I was pleasantly surprised by the film. I remember I hadn't really heard anything about the film. It just pops up on Netflix screen, and I'm like, wow, there's a new adaptation of this old kind of novel and this old film. I didn't have a lot of like expectations for it, partly because Netflix films tend not to be all that great, but this one's very well made film. The cinematography, as Jason mentioned, the music in particular, quite an unusual score. And it does hint at some other themes, like some environmental themes, I think, that weren't there in the original, are kind of in this one, like the fact that war is clearly destroying the land itself. It's a very effective film, and I think I don't think it has much of a chance to win the Oscar, but I could see it getting some other kind of below the line awards. It'll probably win international feature, and I think. I was quite pleasantly surprised. It is, a grueling film, but it also is, again, the filmmaking kind of carries you through, and I was very engaged with it the whole time. Yeah.
It's better than 1917.
Yes.
Okay.
Also, First World War film.
Okay, so that was All Quiet on the Western Front, and it's available on Netflix to stream. That's all for Movie Spotlight this week. Jason, Mark, it's been a pleasure as always, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Take care.
Thank you.